Like many others in the online non-dual community, I watched David McDonald's video. I'm not going to go into it here. Suffice to say, I don't agree with him about the conclusions he made about his experience. But one thing in the video was really interesting to me, and I guess I heard it before, but I never thought about it, which is regarding the default mode network, and how non-dual teachers are always talking about staying out of the default mode network. I don't know if I've heard that before, but it makes a lot of sense. And this gets subtler and subtler. And I don't usually like to talk about neuroscience or relate this to scientific things because I feel like it's easy to get confused and say too much or too little. I don't know. But here, it makes a little bit of sense. Default mode network. You could see it as just default states, just states that the mind sits in. That it, let's say a standing wave, stands in a standing wave. And that can describe a lot of consciousness, of what's experienced. And there's a lot of sense of self that comes from that. And a lot of suffering that comes from that, from trying to keep all these things coherent. Or let's say a standing wave that stands too long. And it kind of pulls in what's next to it. This tension there. So I made up a new meditation that I've been experimenting with and has been interesting. I use a metronome and set it to 10 beats per minute or less. And I sit and meditate. Say the metronome clicks, whatever is most salient in experience, whatever sticks out the most, I say bring that to the foreground, but I don't want to say background and foreground. Ideally it takes over the entire experience, but that's not always the case. And part of me wants to say default mode network, that that's still engaged. So there's this experience of subject and object, but sometimes, often actually, it does take over the entire experience. And it's just that whatever it is, a sound, a thought, a tension in the body. I suppose with vision, it's a bit more tricky. In any case, bring what's most salient at the time when the metronome clicks to the foreground. Let it overtake you. Let it overtake if it can. Metronome clicks, move on to whatever's salient. The next salient thing, the next salient thing, the next salient quanta of perception, of cognition. The goal here is to train the mind, or to have insight. one understand anicca. All is changing all the time. Understand anatta, there's no self in there. There's no self in there. And all of this symphony of experience, there's no self in there, and there doesn't need to be. In fact, that ghost of self that is suffering, the third characteristic of reality in Buddhism, suffering, dukkha. Without that self pushing and pulling, that's the end of suffering. No self, no suffering. That's where I am at the moment.